Hey.
In my QM, I'm not able to put the attendance code. It says it's no more classes today. So.
Ah, strange. Okay. Let me see if I can do it via mine. Okay, so it seems they've given me a code, but it's not actually possible to check in students. Okay, so you're fine. Okay, now it's working. Okay.
No, it's still.
Okay. That's nothing else I can do. It's working. All right, good evening, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. First, quick question. Is anybody actually managing to sign in? Okay, so I think for whatever reason, they've given me a code and it shows up on the list, but it doesn't allow you guys to sign in, so fair enough. That's easy enough. So, welcome to the last class of the semester for International Commercial Law. Amazing how far we've gone and how much the weather has improved since our first class. So, what I want to do is really look back a bit, pick up a few issues that we haven't necessarily picked up sufficiently, and then we'll wrap up by not only looking forward a little bit, but also go through in some detail assessment expectations. So, first, any questions, comments from anything that you've covered, that we've covered the last several weeks with Peter? All right. Other than to say that we were, in some ways incredibly fortuitous to have a major global energy crisis and to be talking about legal issues related to commercial energy was sometimes these things happen. So basically we started out with this as our series of objectives. And this is important because as we come to talk about the design of the assessment, these are really the things that we're trying to figure out. Have we actually managed to achieve, and have the assessment actually, if you will, help to achieve them? So the first, have an understanding of the role of law in international commercial transactions. And I think this has been, if you think about our key underlying theme, it has really been about international commerce, how commerce works in a very rapidly changing environment, and the role of law in those commercial transactions. Second, have an understanding of the major sources of international commercial law. And what we've seen across the semester are a variety of mechanisms by which we around the world have tried to build systems to use law to help international commercial transactions function better. We've seen a range of examples which have been relatively successful in many cases. We've seen a range of examples which haven't been very successful. We've seen a variety of different approaches by different types of organizations in a wide range of different aspects of transactions. Third, be able to analyze the role of technology in international commercial law and regulatory responses. And essentially, the idea here is the idea that in addition to thinking about the way that economics impacts transactions, in addition to thinking about the role of law in transactions, in addition to thinking about the various parties in transactions, we focus throughout the course on the way that technology impacts transactions and actually provides a mechanism for addressing a range of issues in transactions. Be able to critically discuss contemporary business trends and their implications for international commercial law. Throughout the entire semester, we spent a fair amount of time on real-world examples, and particularly in the form of news stories. The idea is to be able to understand the major trends that we're seeing in international commerce and to see how international commercial law is addressing these, how it is in some cases failing to address these, and of course, in some cases, how it is being developed to try to address these changes. And finally, understand the role of law in an international commercial transaction and apply the knowledge to business situations. So if we look at what we've covered, we began with this idea of international commerce and international commercial law. We then looked at the process of making international commercial law. And then we turned to a series of areas. We looked first at sale of goods. We looked also at technology and digitization. We looked at money and payment. We looked at financing. We looked at energy and natural resources, both generally as well as in the context of transport and insurance, less in the insurance context, much more in the sort of transport around LNG and issues around force majeure. Structures. We looked at the way that different commercial relationships can be structured, and we spent a lot of time over the past several weeks talking about dispute resolution. And certainly one of the biggest aspects of the current conflict, current war in Iran is a lot of disputes. And that is something that certainly over the past several years, we've seen an increasing range of volatility in all aspects of sort of the world as well as in commercial transactions. And those are definitely bringing an increased range of activities from the standpoint of dispute resolution. And finally today, looking a bit at future directions, and in addition to something about digitization of trade, I also provided a piece looking at space, which is one of those areas where we're now starting to see some pretty rapid development from the commercial standpoint, but relatively less development so far from the standpoint of international commercial law. And we looked at this idea of what is commerce, and in many ways, the focus that we've taken throughout has been to try to avoid things, to try to avoid finance and financial regulation, to try to avoid public law relating to trade, and to try to focus as much as possible on professional, business to business commercial transactions, and always with an international or a transnational element. And I think what we've seen is, as we've looked at this idea of sources, we've seen a wide variety of different approaches and different sources. One can think of aspects such as formal public international law, and we've seen a number of examples throughout the course of public international law, treaty-based approaches, which have an impact from the standpoint of private commercial transactions. Obviously, contract, but contract not only from the standpoint of each individual contract being the same, but rather from the standpoint of mechanisms to standardize contracts, and in some cases to standardize not only terms, but also the operation of terms. Trade usage, trade terms. These are aspects which we've seen across a variety of specific commercial areas. In other words, in some cases over centuries, different areas have developed practices in their own areas of commerce. Some cases, these have been formalized through a variety of industry processes. In other cases, they have been generalized through international processes. And in others, they're simply known and understood in the context of individual areas of business. But these can become very important from the standpoint of the operation of all aspects of international commercial law. National law, certainly unavoidable, and we've certainly seen some variations, but a real open question, and that has been whether or not some of these issues of problems or challenges in international commerce are in fact universalizable, so that it doesn't necessarily matter which jurisdiction or which legal system you're struggling with common problems, and that draws you to attempt to develop international approaches. We've seen lots of private rulemaking and self-regulation. The idea of industry associations, some general like the ICC, others industry-specific, developing rules and systems to govern commerce amongst their members. Regulation. There is a tendency in the world of international commercial law to try to focus to the greatest extent possible only on private law. But I think you've picked up across the course of this semester, in reality, regulatory aspects have a big impact from the standpoint of the operation of international commercial transactions. And really, there is no way to simply not think about issues of regulation in the context of an international commercial transaction. And finally, this idea, a sort of theory in many ways, that over centuries, merchants, professional commercial parties, have developed systems of addressing the rules for their transactions and dispute resolution mechanisms which are designed to operate independently of national legal systems. And we've seen some examples that have been not too far from that. It's an ideal that does, in some cases, come close to existence, but in no case can one really completely escape the realities of the national legal systems that commercial transactions take place across in the context of business. Now, if we think about this idea, we've tried to avoid international economic law, international financial and monetary law. There is absolutely a necessary overlap with international business law, but that's a subject that's broader. And so in many ways, part of the process of the semester has actually been trying to figure out what the subject is. It's one of those subjects that doesn't have a precise definition, and in many ways, one is often defining it by what it is not, by looking at other areas and contrasting those approaches and mechanisms. If we think about the evolution, we've seen across a variety of different time periods the evolution of different mechanisms to support international commerce through various legal structures. And one can really see this history in the context of the major organizations which we've looked at as international commercial law actors across the semester. One can think about, in particular, the Hague Conference as being one of our earliest international processes to develop rules for cross-border activities. One can think about UNIDROIT developing in the context of the League of Nations structure. You can think about UNCITRAL developing in the context of the post-Second World War UN structure. We can think about the ICC developing as a private mechanism in parallel from the beginnings of the early 20th century. And of course, we can think about more recently a series of other organizations like the International Standards Organizations. But the key takeaway is that there is no single organization that is tasked with core responsibility. In fact, we have a series of similar organizations, Hague Conference, UNIDROIT, UNCITRAL, which in many ways actually compete with one another from the standpoint of trying to address different issues. All of them have mandates or activities that are broader than the area that we've looked at in the context of the course, perhaps because international organizations are always looking for something that they're trying to do. We also see each of these three, in many cases, competing with one another. Throughout the semester, in many cases, each organization has tried to address similar sorts of issues with differing levels of success. And of course, we've also seen the various private sector organizations, particularly the ICC, but we've looked at also a number of sector-specific organizations across the course. If we think about some of those big picture developments from the standpoint of business, the ones that we've really picked up across the course, technology, obviously, sustainability has come up a number of times, particularly in the regulatory context, and this question about globalization and fragmentation. These are all issues that if we want to think about big picture trends affecting business and commerce, are core. Now, what I want to do is pick up a couple of news stories that I think relate to some of our issues. And then I want to turn to filling in a couple of pieces. The first is not surprising. We've been focusing mainly over the past few weeks from the standpoint of C. If you think about oil, LNG, major national resources shipments, much of their transit, much of their shipping takes place by sea. And of course, we've seen huge disruptions in that area. But something that we focused a bit less on is that we've also had pretty huge disruptions from the standpoint of air cargo. One obvious reason, if you think about it, is that certainly our big Gulf airlines, Emirates and Qatar, are two of your biggest air shippers. And so disruptions to their schedules obviously has an impact. And with that as well, the disruption of a big chunk of airspace that is very busy from the standpoint particularly of transactions and transport between much of East Asia and South Asia and Europe and North Africa. And so this story essentially highlights a couple of those pieces. Air cargo rates surge as Middle East conflict disrupts global routes. Global air rates are surging as the ongoing Middle East conflict forces carriers to bypass traditional Gulf hubs and absorb rising fuel costs. This last point is one where some of the issues around disruption of fuel supplies that we've been looking at over the past several weeks really comes together also with air cargo. In other words, the fact that we are seeing increases in jet fuel prices, and this is being passed on not only from the standpoint of individuals flying, but also from the standpoint of cargo costs. Average global freight prices climbed to $3.1 per kilogram in the week ending April 5th, a 21% increase from a year earlier. Regional airspace closures have severely constrained international supply chains and triggered a rapid restructuring of aviation networks, adding hours to flight times and imposing war risk premiums on shippers worldwide. But notice, $3.10 per kilo for air freight. It's still pretty cheap, actually. And if we think about this, this is something that very much differentiates large bulk goods, things like oil, gas, natural resources, from smaller, higher value items. And even in the context of, we looked earlier in the semester at business models for firms like Shen and Temu, we can see that many of the things that are actually being shipped are actually quite light. And if one even thinks that something may be a kilogram in weight, the extra $3 from the standpoint of shipping costs for air freight really highlights that how, in many cases, for smaller, lighter, higher value items, we've seen a real transformation from the standpoint of air freight. It also does highlight, though, if you think about the last time you ordered something from Amazon and you paid shipping costs, just how much their markup is on the shipping costs. That's a huge markup in many cases. And this is a much higher rate than we were showing just a few weeks ago. So a 21% increase from a year earlier. It's a dramatic increase, but it's still at relatively low levels. Prices are rising despite a broader decline in cargo volumes. Global shipments fell 9% week on week in early April, largely due to the Easter holiday, but the conflict-driven premium offset typical seasonal downward pressure on rates. Price rally, price increases, heavily concentrated, not surprisingly, in the Middle East and South Asia. Spot rates from the region to Europe and the United States have surged 87% and 71% year on year, respectively. Now, this is something that if one is thinking about shipping to or from the Middle East or South Asia to Europe or North America, or if you're talking about Middle East, even to South Asia or East Asia, these are huge increases from the standpoint of air freight costs. And so in the same way that we've seen quite differential impact in the context of oil prices, for instance, depending on which specific benchmark you're looking at, we're also seeing very different impact from the standpoint of air shipping rates. The crisis, although recent ceasefire signals, since fighting broke out in late February, air freight capacity in the Gulf region has shrunk by more than half compared with pre-war levels. Not surprisingly, you've had massive reductions in major carrier capacity from the region, and as a result, the availability of air freight across the region is dramatically constrained. Although recent ceasefire signals led to a 15% increase in capacity, the crisis has effectively dismantled and rebuilt global and air transit routes in just over a month. Cargo flows are shifting north from the Gulf to alternative hubs in Turkey, Azerbaijan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. This is an interesting one. Turkey, not surprising at all. If you think about Turkish Air already pre-crisis was the airline with the most connections of any airline in the world. So it already was in a strong position. If you essentially take out its major competitors of Emirates and Qatar from the standpoint of cargo capacity, the fact that you already have the connections with Turkish is not surprising that Turkish would pick up volume. As well, obviously, as those of you who've flown through there recently will know, there's been a massive expansion of the capacity of the airport so that they have been able to pick up that drop. Now, if we think about Egypt, this is an interesting one. And anyone who's flown through an Egyptian airport recently wouldn't necessarily think of that as an efficiency alternative in comparison with an airline like Turkish and the Istanbul airport. But Egypt Air does have a range of useful connections, particularly into a number of cities within the region that is providing an attractive alternative for some. Azerbaijan, we've seen some increased capacity, and Saudi Arabia, likewise, coming, if you think about the standpoint of the Saudi airlines, at a useful time because you've had a process of trying to expand the capacity of a number of those carriers. Aviation data provider Verflight said cargo connectivity at Qatar's Doha and Bahrain hubs had fallen to less than 7% of normal levels, which is really an absolute collapse. This basically means that we're seeing almost no cargo capacity out of Qatar Air, which prior to the crisis was one of our largest cargo carriers. By contrast, freight operations in Istanbul, Baku, Cairo, and Riyadh have exceeded their pre-war baselines. Flights on major routes, such as Hong Kong to Doha, have been sharply reduced, while traffic between Hong Kong and Baku has nearly doubled. As we mentioned earlier in the semester, Cathay Pacific out of Hong Kong tends to be the world's leading cargo carrier. And so it's interesting to see how Cathay is rerouting flights to try to get around regional issues. Rerouting flights over Central Asia or North Africa adds 1 to 3 hours of flying time, significantly increasing fuel consumption and operating costs, according to global logistics provider C.H. Robinson. We saw C.H. Robinson earlier in the semester when we were looking at freight forwarders and logistics companies, and the fact that you have these firms right now in very high demand, obviously, because trying to come up with alternative routes to get key pieces, key components from place to place is proving a major challenge. Indian exporters are bearing the brunt of these operational disruptions. Highly dependent on Gulf hubs, shippers in India are now facing general cargo booking delays of 5 to 7 days as limited freighter capacity is stretched thin. Willie Walsh, director of the International Air Transport Association, said the disruption makes the market's trajectory difficult to predict. He added that an early end to the conflict is essential to stabilize volatile fuel supplies and restore critical aviation hubs. So I think this is an interesting counterpoint to many of the focus stories around impact on LNG and oil, not only from the standpoint of prices and disruption, but also to see the competitiveness of the air shipping rates and how, from the standpoint of major hubs, the ability and the efforts to reroute routes to get around some of these service issues, despite effectively the loss of huge capacity from the two big Gulf airlines. All right. And just to pull up the other big story of the week that somehow did manage to compete. And of course, this was the space mission transiting around the moon. And in some ways, that space mission is one reason why throughout the article that you've got, that I gave you for reading for this week, on essentially commercializing the moon. Because certainly something that we've discovered with the current US administration is that while historically the American government and business may have always been criticized for trying to commercialize everything, there's a pretty good argument that that is in fact a good characterization of the current administration's direction. And certainly a view that part of the rationale of not only this recent US mission, but also the mission from China last year to circumnavigate the moon, that there are commercial rationales for these processes, and that things that were previously somewhat theoretical commercializing mining, for instance, on the moon. These are now things that we legitimately have governments, but also importantly, private sector companies looking at. And I've actually got 3 stories that I picked up on this that I think are interesting. The first is just about the financing aspect. A lot of focus from the standpoint of finance recently, over the past several years, has been very heavily focused on AI. But I think this is an interesting story, and this is around SpaceX. SpaceX, of course, is a packaging of really 3 different pieces. It's the Elon Musk space enterprises, which have become incredibly successful from the standpoint of space commerce. They also are things like X, formerly Twitter, which has been less successful from a commercial standpoint. And bringing the AI trend together, also the AI operations, which also incorporate the X business, as well as the Grok system and others. So what you have essentially got is a package of a variety of things, but the headline is about raising what would be the world's largest initial public offering for the financing of a space company. And that's kind of an interesting statement, to say that space has now made it to the point where global investors see it as not only a viable commercial proposition, but actually as one that is attractive. So this is really more finance to commerce, but I want to just flag a couple of things. SpaceX seeking to raise about $75 billion, targeting a valuation of roughly $1.75 trillion. This would put it behind NVIDIA, Apple, Alphabet, Microsoft, and Amazon, but above everybody else. The company was valued at roughly $90 billion in 2022. The IPO, which would dwarf the $29 billion raised by oil major Saudi Aramco in 2019, is expecting sometime potentially in June. Yeah, you've got to love this. At Musk's behest, with a rare planetary alignment, it is a space company after all, and his 55th birthday. And if you're going to have the world's largest IPO, you might as well have it right around your birthday. KeyBank Analysis estimates SpaceX made about $21 billion in total revenue across its various divisions. Now, the key revenue earner is, in fact, the space transactions. The other elements from the standpoint of AI and X don't really bring in a lot of revenue. And that's quite interesting from the standpoint of this idea of commercial space operations. They're bringing in a good $20 billion a year from space, from launching on a regular basis commercial spacecraft loaded with all sorts of things into space. So that, I think, is interesting. 2 other pieces. This is a little bit of a comparison. Satellite maker Space raises $190 million to advance IPO plans. What is this? This is a Chinese commercial satellite maker. In other words, they make satellites, and they've just raised $190 million as part of a private funding round, which would be prior to an IPO, probably in Hong Kong, in the next 2 to 3 years. So a little bit about this one. Chinese commercial satellite developer Lec10 has raised 1.3 billion yuan, about 190 million US, in equity financing to scale up production as it advances plans for an initial public offering. The fundraising comes as a growing number of Chinese commercial aerospace startups rush to public markets to fund capital-intensive efforts to compete with global peers. We looked a lot across the semester at Chinese aircraft companies and the way in which we're seeing expansion of that as a major commercial area going forward. This is from the standpoint of space. This is a satellite maker. And we've seen major initiatives, both by China, but also an increasing range of other countries from the standpoint of business use cases for satellites and thus commercial building. This is Lec10, building satellites, and companies like SpaceX, which are doing the launching process. And of course, this is commerce. We've seen, of course, the things, that's the satellites, those are your sort of goods. We have the transport, this is your sort of SpaceX. This is, instead of looking at air cargo or sea cargo or road cargo, this is space cargo. And we, of course, are also seeing the financing mechanisms. In other words, how do you go about financing these various transactions? These are a couple of IPO and private fundraising examples. And of course, that takes us to payment. And if we really wanted to go one step further, we also have insurance. Because you need insurance from the standpoint of a commercial satellite. You also need insurance if you are a private company launching a big rocket, because who knows where that thing is going to come down if it goes wrong. And so when we think about our various pieces of a commercial transaction, we now see all of these expressed in the context of space transactions as well. Let me come back to this. All right. So, taking our structure, if we look at glitchy system today, we look at our structure, and this is something that we've developed as a means to analyze an individual transaction, to think about the barriers, the problems, the transaction costs, the inefficiencies in a transaction, but also to think about the points at which international commercial law processes focus. You can think about your transaction as having a variety of pieces. Your commercial sale or purchase, but as we saw, that sale or purchase can not only be for a full transfer of ownership, you also have this possibility of separating ownership from possession. In other words, a lease transaction. That is something that, from a commercial standpoint, one party is leasing something to the other. That is effectively a financing structure, but it is achieved by dividing these ideas of ownership and possession. We saw, likewise, the adding in the context of the payment mechanism. And I'm going to come back to a couple of little points from a payment standpoint, because, of course, over the past several weeks, we have, as a result of the Iran war, we have seen some interesting developments from the standpoint of alternative payment mechanisms, particularly for ships looking to transit the Strait of Hormuz over the past several weeks. So payment, financing, we've looked at financing mechanisms. We've also thought about shipping and transport. And of course, if one thinks about space, one can realize that the satellites that are being developed, sometimes the satellites are being sold directly to a buyer. That buyer is then paying for effectively transport of the satellite into space or the upper atmosphere. There is, in many cases, a related financing structure that will go with that. We're also seeing, however, increasing structures which, like aircraft, may be lease-based. In other words, you may simply lease use of a satellite that is already in space that has certain commercial functions. In other words, the satellite is there, the company which owns the satellite has put it up, and they lease out communications functions, energy collection functions, surveillance functions, all sorts of different functions can be leased or rented or purchased without necessarily owning the satellite directly. And of course, this shows from the standpoint of space that in many ways, as we think about this new area, the fact that the same sorts of transaction structures, the same sorts of functional issues arise. And once we move from a purely governmental standpoint and we start involving private parties, you begin to have both the same sorts of legal mechanisms as well as technological approaches. We saw in the context of looking at the Cape Town Convention that it does have a space protocol, not yet into effect, a small number of countries which have implemented that. But it's something that as space transactions increase, there's a fair argument that the leading economies from which those commercial activities are taking place will increasingly look at these sorts of mechanisms to address the problems, to increase efficiencies and deal with the legal issues that are arising. Now, back to space tea. The multi-round fundraising due participation from institutional investors, mainly Chinese institutional investors. The fresh capital will be used to optimize manufacturing technologies for mass production. So in other words, this is a satellite company that is moving to mass production. In other words, the idea is that you're not just building one satellite at a time, but increasingly you're looking at mass producing satellites. And certainly if you think about the SpaceX system, one thing that has happened out of that has been the placement of literally tens of thousands of smaller satellites into orbit. We've seen a real change from large satellites, which are placed for long periods of time in high orbits, to smaller satellites with shorter lifespans, which are placed in lower orbits. And as a result of geopolitics, we're now seeing a number of jurisdictions, including China, the EU, Japan, and others, looking to make sure that they have their own large-scale network of satellites in place that are available both for surveillance purposes, but also from the standpoint of communications and embedding data into AI systems. And of course, it does flag the point that we saw earlier in the semester, also about questions around, can you actually begin placing data centers, for instance, in space as a means to, one, both get energy directly from the sun to reduce energy costs, but also to address cooling problems. One of your biggest challenges from the standpoint of a data center is heat production. Obviously, if you're in space, heat production is something that the coldness of space has a very particular applicability to. We're not yet to commercial viability, but this is the sort of thing that is getting close. And I should mention one other, just writing up something for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, looking at essentially commercialization of satellites. And one aspect of this has been something that we're seeing across large chunks of the world, which is last mile communications for businesses and individuals. In other words, if you are in parts of Central Asia, for instance, you have small populations, you have large mountains, and the costs of traditional fixed line infrastructure or mobile communications infrastructure doesn't really work. And so increasingly we're seeing projects which are designed to put up essentially arrays of thousands of satellites in space, which are designed to be able to provide access to communications for large portions of regions which were previously underserved. What's the commercial model? Data. If you get enough people using the communication system, the collection of that data and the services which you can operate over these networks becomes central. So, commercialization of space is one of those things that I think when one thinks about some of the ideas we've looked at across the course is one where we're now seeing real live developments. Spacey entered the IPO touring phase on February 3 with Guotao Haitong Securities. Founder and Chief Executive Officer Yang Feng is the controlling shareholder, holding a 30% stake, and both founders previously worked at state-owned space agencies, which is something that we're seeing quite frequently, which is people that were working at government space agencies are taking ideas, taking connections, taking technologies, and moving into the private sector. Founded in 2015, the company initially built research satellites for universities before expanding into synthetic aperture radar remote sensing satellites. SAR technology uses electromagnetic waves to generate high-resolution images unaffected by weather, clouds, or lighting conditions, making it valuable for disaster relief, urban safety, and infrastructure monitoring. Spacey launched China's first privately developed satellite, Xiaoshang-1, in 2016, and the country's first commercial SAR remote sensing satellite in 2020. The company has completed 21 space missions and launched 38 satellites to date. Yang, the CEO, said in October 2023 that the company's factory can produce 50 CubeSats and 10 flat panel satellites each year. China's satellite sector started late and remains in a catch-up phase. Spacey's listing efforts coincide with a range of IPOs in China's commercial aerospace sector, rocket manufacturing, a series of rocket manufacturers, and a series of other satellite manufacturers. So, one last piece is FT editorial, looking at the other side of this, which is quite interesting. As SpaceX gears up for an IPO, America should avoid becoming over-reliant. Last week, the same day as the Artemis II mission blasted off for the first human flight around the moon in more than 50 years, it emerged that Elon Musk's SpaceX had filed for a record-breaking stock market listing to raise as much as $75 billion. The coincidence brought the past and future of U.S. space exploration into sharp relief. One involves an expensive government program seeking to rekindle the awe of Apollo-era human spaceflight. The other, an entrepreneur gearing up to tighten his grip on the commercial space economy. Contrast this with SpaceX. whose Falcon rockets have become the workhorse for reaching orbit. Musk's success was the product of a newer commercial economic model. From the start, NASA paid a fixed cost per launch, leaving all the financing risk with the company. SpaceX has also dragged down costs by reusing his rockets. If SpaceX IPO goes as planned, Musk will have the resources to entrench his company deeper into the markets it already dominates. That includes seeing its giant Starship rocket through to full commercial operations, further increasing its launch cost advantage over rivals, and overlaying the Starlink communications network with a third generation of more powerful satellites. Competition in the launch market should soon be at hand in the form of a new generation of powerful rockets from companies like Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin, Rocket Lab, and Relatively Space, as well as Chinese and European manufacturers. So, the takeaway here is actually scale. We're moving beyond small rockets to much larger rockets with larger payloads, and increasingly thinking about commercialization of a much broader spectrum, beginning with data, but certainly these recent lunar missions are by no means coincidental. So, this has been really our key framework throughout the course. This idea that when one thinks of commercial law and also technology, as one moves beyond instant transactions to deal with time, distance, and risk, one needs mechanisms. They could be relational, they could be legal, they could be technological to address these issues. Relational, we looked at structure. Structure is how you may structure a series of relations that are core to a transaction. Technology. Technology we've seen applied across a variety of aspects to change time, distance, and risk, managing some risks, creating others. We've seen our international commercial law processes engaged across time, distance, and risk across the pieces of the transaction structure we've looked at. If there's no time, distance, and risk, if it's just an instantaneous transaction, there's no real need for law. That's the key point. As you add time, distance, and risk, you need mechanisms to make those transactions justifiable. That allows complexity, supply chains, specialization, supply chains, and predictability of transactions. All of this reduces transaction costs and supports efficiency. And to a certain extent, it also enables us to go beyond relationship-based systems to broader trust environments. In other words, you don't necessarily have to know or trust your counterparty if you trust the technology, the platform, or there is a legal arrangement which makes this possible. And we then looked at this across a number of contexts. And I do want to just flag two last things. First is this. We've talked about stablecoins. Hong Kong grants first stablecoin licenses to Standard Chartered and HSBC. The timing has absolutely nothing to do with geopolitics. It just happens to be that this was the time that the process came to a conclusion. But it is very interesting in a broader geopolitical context that you have two giant financial institutions, and we've looked at both of these in the context of both their payments as well as their trade finance roles, license to provide Hong Kong dollar stable coins and the possible optionality of this from the standpoint of both payments, but also from the standpoint of financing. Note, no RMB stablecoin license. This is a Hong Kong dollar stablecoin license, but that's interesting in and of itself. The second piece is this one. Payment mechanisms for ships. And essentially, we've seen the acceptance of CNY, Chinese yuan, for payments. We've also seen acceptance of cryptocurrencies. And this is interesting from the standpoint of this idea that we talked about earlier, from the standpoint that we're seeing questions around this idea of monetary instrument in cross-border transactions, that we're now seeing choices, different options being taken, this obviously for a range of reasons, but quite interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see, of course, if the US offers a similar mechanism in the context of its own blockade, which is just apparently about to start at any point in time, and whether there also might be a payment mechanism to get ships through the US side. From the standpoint of the Iranian side, sort of standardized level, which was meant to be around, ironically, $1 a barrel. So even though we're pricing in CNY and paying in cryptocurrency, people are still continuing to use the price terms in a dollar standard, even though the systems and mechanisms are quite different. And at this stage, we have two options. One option is I can spend some time talking about particularly aspects around trade terms, Incoterms, FOB, CIF, etc., which we haven't covered quite as much in the earlier class on LNG as I would have liked, or knowing that you're actually completely finished with all of your other courses, we can skip straight to the assessment review. So, hands for skip to the assessment review. Right. Hands for FOB, CIF, Incoterms. All right. Let's do it this way then. I'll go through the assessment now, and those of you who want to go after the assessment discussion at the break, you're welcome to do so. Those who want to stick around for a discussion around Incoterms can do so after the break. Yeah? All right. So, assessment structure. Essentially, as we've said since the very beginning, you'll have 5 questions. You have to answer 2 out of the 5. But we've actually specified those questions into 2 groups. So group 1 is 3 questions, and you have to answer 1 question for group 1. Group 2 is 2 questions, and you have to answer 1 question from group 2. Structure makes sense? Okay. The group 2 questions The first is the topic that we've been focusing on a lot over the past couple of weeks, which is around force majeure. How does it operate? How do you call it? What are the implications? And what are the differences between civil and common law countries? So that's one option. The other option is one that we've discussed throughout the entire course, but clearly we've spent a lot more time in the past couple of weeks, which is around dispute resolution in international commercial transactions. In other words, why is arbitration the primary choice in international commercial disputes? And so, if one is thinking about Group 2, one of those two questions. We'll come back to questions in just a minute. Group 1. The Group 1 questions, 3 questions, pick one of the Group 1 questions. First question is about international commercial transaction structures and the role of technology and international commercial law processes in these transaction structures. This has been one of our big themes throughout the course, and therefore one of the questions. Second question is really around the approaches to international commercial law. In other words, we've looked at a lot of different approaches throughout the course. What are the problems that those approaches have looked at, and what has worked? The final one is for those of you who have a specific interest in this sort of topic, and that is around this idea that we've discussed once again throughout the course of universality of international commercial law. In other words, is this whole international commercial law system that we've looked at across the semester, is this a Western colonialist construct, or imposition, as you may prefer, or is this something that has some universality? In other words, would a jurisdiction like China develop the same system? And so that, from the standpoint of the third question, is this idea around universality or not of international commercial law. So I'll open it for questions in just a minute. Structure. This is one of these sorts of slightly odd Queen Mary CCLS FAE structures, which means that you get basically 5 hours in a 24-hour period to do that, which basically means that you've got 24 hours to answer. So you get it, and you have a deadline to submit it, which is about 24 hours later. You then pick 2 of the 5 questions, one from Group 1, one from Group 2. And you have, I believe, 4,500 words, maybe 5,000 words, to address the 2 questions in that 24-hour period. And before I open it for questions, one other thing that I should mention, there is, in several of these questions, a request to use specific real-world examples. In other words, we've spent a lot of time throughout the semester looking at real-world examples. The expectation in several of the questions is that you will use real-world examples to argue your point or to discuss the question. So let me now open it for questions. First, I'd say, any questions on the sort of structure? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I'm not sure whether it's either 4,500 or 5,000. but it's a small difference between 4,500 and 5,000. Yeah. So the two questions are equally weighted. You can use as much or as little on each question, but at the end of the day, the weighting of the two questions is the same. There's a hand over here. Yeah. So the question is, do you have to connect the topics with each other? And the answer is no. So you don't have to connect the questions, and particularly, you're choosing two questions from different groups. It would be a lot to try to add you to ask you to also interconnect them. But it is very important when you're addressing the questions to actually answer the question that's been asked. Others? Yeah. Yes. So the word count does include footnotes, but if you have a sort of bibliography with bracketed sources, that's not included. Yes? So for reference style, we haven't applied a single style. In other words, you all are from a wide range of different jurisdictions and backgrounds. The key from the standpoint of citation is to use a style consistently. And that's really the key, is that one, we can figure out what the sources are. And there are a variety of different citation styles, each of which achieve that objective. So you don't have to use a single style. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. And one thing about each of these questions is that they're designed not to have a right answer. In other words, you can take a wide range of different approaches and take different views on any of these questions. The key is to actually look at what's been asked in the question, analyze that, tie it to, in many cases, but not every case, some real world examples, and come up with a view. So that's, I think, from our standpoint, at the end of the day, that's the sort of process. In other words, you have a question, you're using the tools that we've developed throughout the semester to analyze that question. You're trying to bring in some of the real world examples that, not necessarily just the ones we've covered in class, there are infinite real world examples that one could bring in, and then to come to a view on the basis of that analysis. That's really from the standpoint of what, if one is thinking about what is critical thinking, that's what it is. And that's really what we're looking for. And the key with each of these is not the answer. You can come up with whatever answer you want, but the key is how you get to that answer. Others? Yeah. There's no single structure, and each of you will write and argue in different ways. Some will use introductions and conclusions, but they're short essays, so it's a little bit up to you whether you think you need it. I probably would say that for an essay of this length, something like a table of contents probably isn't necessarily the best use of your time or word length. But an introduction or a conclusion, these can be good. But it's, once again, there's no single structure yet. Others? All right, so that's the structure. Any questions from the standpoint of the content of the 5 questions? The hope is that there's not really any surprise from the content, because these are the issues that we've really covered throughout the course. And we've tried to sort of signpost throughout the course that these were areas or frameworks or issues that we viewed as important. And so hopefully there aren't any surprises. We didn't want to have any surprises from the standpoint of the questions. All right, so, yeah, please. Absolutely. But if all you do is more or less summarize the lecture slides, that's probably not going to be quite enough. But in some of these, where it's talking about a transaction structure, or it's talking about, for instance, the different aspects of why you have commercial law, these are core things that we've looked at throughout the course. So yeah, the slides are a good starting point. Yeah.
If you use like graphs or charts, for example, to define the structure of that section,
Yeah.
does that also go into the word count or not?
It does go into the word count. If it's a graph, obviously there aren't many words in a graph. I can sort of say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So a graph, if it only has 2 or 3 words in it, only has 2 or 3 words. From the standpoint of time, it's a bit of a question what you can create. Tables, it's something that frequently some people will use tables. It can be effective. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. So if you're someone who thinks in tables, you structure things, feel free to do so. But for those of you who don't naturally do things in tables, don't feel that there's any reason to have tables. But a table is a perfectly acceptable route if that's a route that you like. Yeah. No, it's not actually required. But to the extent that you quote or you rely on something, then you should provide that reference. But no, in the context of something where you've got a short time period, you're not absolutely required. And it's something that we're less looking in some cases for sort of formal sources and more for the analysis of the sort of real world examples. So, yeah. Others? Yeah. Yeah, I think the system more or less gives sort of 10%-ish in the context of how it works. Yeah. Yeah, so this is something that the question is about use of AI. Queen Mary, unlike some organizations, doesn't really have a sort of view on this. If one is thinking about assessment, the reality is if I don't want you using AI, there are really only 2 assessment systems I can use that will ensure that you don't use it. One is a sit-down exam. So not this sort of 24-hour online thing, but 3 hours sitting in a room or locked in an online system where you have no access. That's one way. The other way is one can basically have a sort of oral exam. In other words, it could be a presentation or it could be an oral exam. We haven't gone that route at CCLS at this stage. And so that's actually left us with, if you think about our major sorts of assessment structures, you have essays, you have these FAEs, you have sort of online exams. And each of these is, from the standpoint of AI vulnerability, it's obvious. These are the sorts of things where You can't stop people. And so, honestly, my assumption at this stage is that if I'm giving you something like an FAE or an essay, I'm pretty much assuming that you are using AI in some fashion. I don't really care whether you do or you don't. The questions are designed in such a way that AI can be helpful, but at the end of the day, it's not going to get you, if you're looking for a sort of outstanding result, it won't get you there. And so at the end of the day, if you're using it, it can help, but you're going to have to work with it in order to get the best results. So that's kind of my takeaway. That, yeah, there's no way to prevent it in this sort of structure. And as a result, one has to sort of, from the standpoint of having read lots of papers and also thinking about how you design things in a certain way that isn't necessarily AI friendly. But someone who is using it can get a useful result out of it. Yeah. There's no single best result. It's 100% important to understand, because if I have a single best result, an AI can get that every time. So the key is there is no right answer. AI performs very well when there's a right answer. But just something that just came out today from the Journal of the American Medical Association looking at AI diagnoses. It's very bad when you give it an unconstrained data environment and allow it to make judgments. It's bad. It doesn't perform well. And in fact, I will notice that because I'm an expert in the subject matter. If you deliver me something that has key errors because you don't understand the subject matter, I'm going to pick that up immediately because I have expertise. If I give you something that has a single answer, then AI is perfect for that. And so that's a design thing. So there is no single answer. And the key is that you guys all can come up with your own views, and you can analyze and basically argue for those. And that's what I want. And ideally, if you can use AI tools to do a better job of it, that's even better. But you should be able to do it, as generations before you have done it, without the AI tools as well, and get just as good of a result. Yeah. I mean, I'm less interested in that and more interested in how you answer the question. Others, yeah.
When it comes to the real world scenario, would you want us to use the ones that you have provided far, or do we get our own?
Yeah, you can use anything you want. So we've definitely gone through enough in class that you have real world examples from class. But if you want to use something else, feel free to do so. Yeah. Yeah. What's worked, what hasn't worked? Yeah. So there could be a combination of the two. Yeah. Yeah.
So for the first question in group one, the international commercial law processes, in classes we really broke it down when in supply chain, we broke it down very well. So in an essay, how would we be able to incorporate those different parts which we really expanded into shorter explanations?
Yeah, so
Especially
that's,
when looking at
one way to structure this one is to take, say, the framework we've used in class and then to expand it and develop it. So that's one way you could do it. And yeah, so that's definitely an approach. And each of these are things that we've looked at in class and we've analyzed so that it's not something that is completely new and foreign. Each of these are things that you've already have some knowledge in. And so the ask is really from the standpoint of taking that and developing it. Yeah.
So for the transaction structures, we looked at different industries like shipping.
Yeah.
So is there going to be a specific industry or industry?
Yeah. We could have, and sometimes I might bring in a specific industry, but in this case, nothing specific, which leaves it really open from your standpoint to pick the ones that you like, are the most interesting, etc. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, yes, your choice. No single prescribed referencing system, but just make sure you use it consistently. Others. Yeah. It's not, some of these are asked somewhat as problem questions, but they're not detailed problem questions. In other words, it's, advise someone in the context of force majeure or discuss someone in the context of transaction structure. But none of them have a detailed fact pattern. They're more all sort of essay questions. Others? All right, well, that takes us really to the end of the majority of the content of the course. We've had a year, once again, where there have been a lot of interesting issues to give real-world context to these issues that we're dealing with, particularly from the standpoint of disputes, but also technologies. We set out with a specific sort of set of objectives, outcomes we wanted at the end of the course, and you now have an idea of what the assessment structure, which is asking you to essentially do or achieve those outcomes, we've set at the beginning. So, this really brings us to the end of the sort of formal portion. For anyone who would like, I'll spend a bit of time after a short break looking at some issues around really transport modalities that are very well covered in the slides in the book. But I'll pick up some issues that I didn't think were fully covered from the course. So, for those of you who want to come back and discuss for a bit longer, we'll come back in about 10 minutes. For those of you who want to get on with studying for the rest of your courses, you are most welcome to do so. And thank you all for it. It's been a really great class throughout the semester. Yeah. Hey.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
My friend unfortunately did not attend
Yeah.
this class, so how would you best prepare for this exam?
I mean, you know what the questions are.
Yeah.
And so then from your standpoint is to think about, which one you want to do. And then thinking about looking in some more detail in that particular subject so you have all of the sorts of understanding of the area so that when you actually get the question, you are best placed to use your 24 hours.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much. I'll relay that information to
You're
you. Nice
welcome.
evening.
Hey,
Just a quick question about the second questioning group one
yeah.
of approaches. So basically just sort of questioning how far they can adopt treatments.
No, the treaties are just one mechanism. As we've seen throughout the course, there are all kinds of different mechanisms and processes, some of which work, some of which have not worked. And so the approaches is not just the formal hard law of
Yeah,
public
sorry,
and
I
national
misspoke.
law.
But I meant in
Yeah,
terms of adoption rate.
some are great, some are not.
So it's just sort of looking at how far.
What has worked, what has not. Yeah,
Thank
exactly.
you very much.
Really thinking about the idea is to think about the spectrum of tools
Yeah.
and how those can be applied and what you can learn from the experiences that you've seen.
I just, are we exposed to different sort of scholarly opinions?
Not necessarily. So,
So
I
we're
mean,
fine without them.
yeah, I mean, it's a 24-hour thing.
So what you can do.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got, in the context, particularly the two books, you have a good treatment from that standpoint. And the book can bring things in, but it's not an expectation.
Thank you very much. It's been
Yeah.
a really interesting module.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Yeah. Yeah, just look me up and you'll find me.
So,
Just type my name. No. They're mini essays. So they're not detailed problems, though some have a problem code. You could. So, what you need to really do is think through which topic you choose. And then be prepared in knowing that topic, so when you see the question, you're prepared to address it. If you come in with just a pre-written topic, that's immediately identifiable that it's not answering the question, and that's not a good result. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Yeah, no prescribed form on the citation. Whatever.
Included to work.
So footnotes, yes, bibliography. Yeah.
Other sources except besides or
Yeah, you can use anything you want. Anything you want.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
yeah, Professor, first I have a question related to in-text citations.
Yeah.
So partially you answered that it's possible. However, I also have a question related to the format of in-text citations. Is it possible to make them short, like to include, for example, the name of the author, page, paragraph, all you need to find the information there, and after that in bibliography to write down the source in a full way. So
Absolutely.
just in order for the
Yeah.
sake of word limits, word count.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's traditional social studies, citation.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Perfect. Then just to clarify, technically it's possible to refer to slides.
Yeah.
Okay, especially to the questions of first part of the exam. Okay, so and then the last question is related to the topics. So, like questions, for example, from second part will be related either to force major or procedure to dispute resolution in international commerce. But like they'll be more specific, but in any case with a room or for reflections, without answer of kind of specific answer. So like in any case, these questions will be related to these topics, right?
Yeah, the essay structure is really similar across all 5 questions.
Oh,
They're all
okay.
written in the same way.
Okay.
So there's not necessarily a difference in sort of specificity. They're all written in kind of the same way.
No, I mean just to clarify, it will be like either force major or dispute resolution, right?
Yeah.
Ah,
Exactly.
okay.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
But something kind of in a specific question related to this area. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you for your clarification. Thank you.
You're welcome. Right.
Sorry,
if you were to mention two cases, for example, like if you have any kind of cases, for example, related to CI,
Yeah.
if you were to mention, would you prefer us to mention just the cases or the specific number?
Just the case is fine.
Just the cases fine.
Yeah.
Also, would you prefer footnotes or bibliography?
I'm perfectly happy either way.
Cool. So footnotes.
Yeah.
And my another question was the handbook code.
Yeah, apparently it's not working today, so.
Yeah, it's we're
Yeah.
not able to put it through.
Yeah.
So whatever. And I had asked Professor Peter as
Yeah.
well, and I have attempted like one of the rough answers
Yeah.
without any like what's it called references.
Yeah.
So if I were to send, can I send to both of you? Because he was like, it's cool.
Yeah, I mean, you're both welcome. So, yeah.
So as soon as I get home, I'll send it to both of you.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Hey, yeah.
I have a question for the citation. You said we can finish now. Could we use like end of sentence, just in text citation?
Yeah. Perfectly fine. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it seems to not be working. That's because it's the end of the sentence.
Oh, I see. So it should be fine then.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Love all the session.
Yeah.
Hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, well, if you're taking, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
much for amazing as an honor and student work. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and get started. What I want to do in this last piece is just talk a little bit about the transport context. And it's something that, across the course, we've spent some time looking at air, we've spent some time looking at sea, spent a little bit of time tonight looking at space. And really just a few pieces that I wanted to pull together. The first is around Incoterms. And Incoterms are something that we mentioned early on in the course when we were talking about sources of law. In other words, the development of Incoterms by the ICC, this is essentially a standardized set of terms to make transport easier. In other words, just to simply say that when someone says a certain phrase, that it has a certain meaning that enables, if you will, transactions to take place more simply. So basically, trade terms primarily devised for mercantile convenience, over time came to be variously interpreted. To reduce misunderstandings, international organizations such as the ICC set out to standardize rules of interpretation. The first set of rules, known as Incoterms, International Rules for the Interpretation of Trade Terms, was published in 1936. Since then, the ICC has periodically introduced new terms and revised existing trade terms to accommodate new modes of transport and emerging trade practices, such as electronic transmission of transport documents. Latest version, published in 2020, updates and consolidates the rules to reflect modern commercial practice of the time. What are they? Essentially, 11 Incoterms rules, each of which is shorthand for a set of rules structuring a commercial sale and the accompanying delivery of goods in a particular manner. So each rule is set out in a 3-letter abbreviation, such as FOB, free on board, and CFR, CIF, that parties may incorporate into their sales contract to allocate their duties, costs, and risks in the sale transaction. So essentially, they describe obligations, who does what between seller and buyer, for example, who organizes carriage or insurance of the goods, or who obtains shipping documents and export or import licenses. In other words, by setting out the meaning of the terms, they set who does what in the context of a transaction. Risk, where and when the seller delivers the goods, in other words, where risk transfers from seller to buyer, and costs. Which party is responsible for which costs, for example, transport, packaging, loading or unloading costs, and checking or security-related costs. So essentially, each of these three-letter terms is shorthand for a package of obligations of risk and cost assignment. And if we look at the structure, structured in 10 articles, with the A articles representing the seller's obligations, and the B articles representing the buyer's obligations. So you have general obligations, delivery, taking delivery, transfer of risks, carriage, insurance, delivery and transport document, export, import, clearance, checking, packaging, marking, allocation of costs, and notices. What the rules don't do. And if we look at this, essentially what this chart does, and you can find these summary documents on the ICC website, essentially the chart lays out under each of your framed three-letter codes who does what. So if we're looking at, for instance, FOB, free on board, transfer of risk, on board vessel. So once the thing is on the vessel, it's effectively transferred from the seller to the buyer. You can see export packaging, seller, loading charges, seller, delivery to port or place of shipment, seller, export duty, taxes and customs clearance, seller, origin terminal charges, seller, loading on carriages, seller, carriage charges, buyer, insurance is negotiable, destination transport, buyer, delivery to destination, buyer, unloading at destination, buyer, import duty, taxes and customs clearance, buyer. If we look at CIF, cost, insurance and freight, transfer of risk, on-board vessel, export packaging, seller, loading charges, seller, delivery to port place of shipment, seller, export duty, taxes, customs, seller, origin terminal charges, seller, loading on carriage is seller, carriage charges. The big difference with CIF and FOB is that the charges of carriage go to the seller and insurance costs go with the seller rather than being negotiable. And if we look at CFR somewhere in between, the difference is that insurance is negotiable, but carriage charges go to the seller. Now, if we look at each of these, and the ones you see the most frequently, this idea of FOB and CIF, probably most common frameworks, one of which is the costs of the carriage are with the seller, and that is CIF. One is costs of carriage are with the buyer, and that is FOB. In CIF, insurance, along with carriage costs, are with the seller. FOB insurance is negotiable. Now, you also have, and these are all for sea or inland waterway. We also have a variety of others which are in terms of any mode of transport, and these are often from the standpoint of, if we look at CIP or CPT, these are transfer of risk at the carrier. And we have the seller responsible all the way down to delivery at terminal. The buyer then essentially takes over in terms of payment from delivery to destination onwards. The key in each of these is to realize that these are standard terms. The definitions have been set as standard trade terms by the ICC. And the expectation is if you use these three-letter codes, you are adopting this framework, unless you've very specifically specified that it's something else. But the idea, and one can easily, and that's the whole idea, you don't necessarily have to memorize what they are, but to know that if the code comes up, you need to be aware of what it means from the standpoint of both parties. What they don't do. They don't necessarily address whether there's a contract of sale at all. We address that in the context of the sale of goods, the Contracts for International Sale of Goods framework, specifications of the goods sold, time, place, method, or currency of payment of the price, remedies which can be sought for breach of the contract, most consequences of delay and other breaches, sanctions, tariffs, import or export prohibitions, force majeure or hardship, intellectual property rights, method, venue, or law of dispute resolution, and transfer of property title ownership of the goods sold. In other words, these are basically carriage and delivery terms. So if one thinks about our contract, our framework under CISG, it will specify the types of goods. It will also, in most cases, specify the type of carriage and the delivery, but the specific terms of the carriage and delivery may be governed in the context of an Incoterms framework, where the parties select a particular code, 3 letters, choice in the context of the means of delivery and the expectations in terms of that delivery, but with the rest of the frameworks generally provided in the context of the sales contract. So if we think about our transaction structure, you can think about the sales contract is your central piece, which covers all the pieces. We've looked at the payment structure. We've looked at the financing structure. This is largely about carriage and transport. Now, carriage and transport, there will be specifications which will be set in the core contract, but then those specifications determine which of the two parties is actually responsible for sorting out the details and various payments in the context of that transportation process. And what you have essentially, the chart, which is on the ICC website, provides a really useful, simple way. And then you have in the Incoterms themselves, and I've put on the next several slides, the detailed FOB and CIF A and B framework. So you can see the delivery, the mode of transport, the export-import clearance, seller's obligations on one side, buyer's obligations on the other. Now, you don't, these are not, yeah.
It includes the bill of lading as well in these
So that will depend on the type of, in other words, each individual thing may or may not use a bill of lading. So for instance, If we're talking air transport, you don't really have a bill of lading. Sea transport generally does have a bill of lading, and so you'll have a specification in the context of your selection what you have. And that, your point is exactly right, is hugely important, because if you have essentially a carriage and transfer structure that involves a bill of lading, that bill of lading is very important because that in many ways is a legally significant document. Whereas something like an air transport certificate isn't really. It's just a certificate that says you loaded the thing on the plane and then you get it off the plane at the other end. We'll come to the bill of lading in just a second. But then, of course, that also takes us, as we saw when we were looking at the payment and financing, particularly in the context of letters of credit, the bill of lading is often a core document from the standpoint of presentment for payment in the context of the transaction. Yeah. So, incorporating interterms, express incorporation is the general and safest mechanism which you will find as a default mechanism in many of your sort of ICC and other standardized contracts. It also can be, if one specifies the terms, that can provide the same function. But where I actually want to go, the key is really that they don't necessarily, they're a description in the context of the transaction structure. In many cases, they require to be operational other contracts. In other words, your seller needs a contract with the shipper, which then reflects those terms. And there is, of course, the risk that there is a mismatch between, for instance, the term chosen in the sales contract and what the seller or buyer actually puts in place with the carriage. And this is something that can come up if there is a dispute. And this is actually why it's important in the context of understanding the structures that are chosen, and as a contractual management process, making sure that the related contracts, in fact, reflect the key elements of your structure chosen. Now, I actually want to skip most of this. Go to this, the bill of lading, because this has really been, yeah, please.
Before we go to the bill of lading, I just had a question. How do you have this to actually agree on the terms being part of the contract? Is there like something, a type of agreement that is deemed to be applied by default, or is it just a matter of dispute?
Yeah, no, it would be, there could be an argument in some industries. You have a standard practice, but unless it's chosen or a three-letter code is somehow indicated, it's not there. But one would expect, you would hopefully have in any sort of contract or sale, some sort of agreed term around delivery. In other words, that would be one of those terms that the buyer and seller would generally view as sufficiently important to be included. But there are, of course, cases where it isn't. So your starting point is going to be the contract. If it's not in other words, there's nothing specified around shipping or delivery of the thing, probably the next level would be to look at the industry practice to see whether or not that there is some normal practice in the industry that one would assume that if the parties simply didn't say anything at all, that they would assume that this is the way things are done in the industry. And then, of course, that takes us really to the arbitration idea, which is that the arbitration framework will seek, in most cases, to find a way to come up with something that is commercially reasonable under the circumstances. Ah, okay. No problem. I was just thinking that was actually an alarm of something and was looking around to see what it was. So, yeah, no problem. Good. Others? Okay, bill of lading. And this is significant because, as we saw earlier in the course, generally speaking, in the letter of credit context, these are still highly paper-based transactions. And one of the reasons for that is because the bill of lading has certain legal functions that have been so far difficult to operationalize in a digital format. And so the bill of lading, legal document issued by a carrier to a shipper. It details the type, quantity, and destination of goods being carried. It also serves as a shipment receipt when the carrier delivers the goods at a predetermined destination. Document must be signed by an authorized representative from the carrier, the shipper, and receiver. Difference from the sea waybill, and we'll see this with the air waybill, where generally speaking in air transport, you're not using a bill of lading. In sea transport, it is generally a bill of lading, but it doesn't have to be. So a sea waybill is not a document of title. A bill of lading is a receipt of the goods shipped. In other words, this is a receipt to say that these goods were put on board the ship. That process of lading is putting the stuff on the ship. So it's a bill of lading. It's a document that says stuff, as documented in the bill, has been laden, put onto the ship. Evidence of the terms of the contract. In other words, we are just highlighting these different three-letter codes. The way in which the bill of lading will say that the seller did something, put the goods onto the shipper. The ship took responsibility at that point. The shipper paid for the carrier being carried, and the carrier has undertaken to deliver the thing to a certain place where it then either must be transited from the place to its final destination, or the buyer, the receiver, is picking the stuff up at the delivery destination. Key bit, negotiable document of title. In other words, from a legal standpoint, the bill of lading is an interesting document, that it is a negotiable document of title for the goods that it reflects. In other words, who has the bill of lading will be seen as the owner of the things that are in the bill of lading at that particular point in time. And that's the point that has been really problematic from the standpoint of digitization. How do you make sure that you have the original, the actual document, and you haven't, because of course in a digital format you can create large numbers of different versions. How do you then determine that the version you have that is digital is the only version? You don't have competing multiple versions and everybody is claiming to have it because they have a digital version. So, negotiable document of title, key. Evidence of the apparent condition of the goods. In other words, and this would be similar once again with an air or a sea air bill or a air way bill, is the way bill will say what the stuff is. And the stuff will generally, it will comment in the context of the condition. In other words, the recipient, the shipper, will say that whatever was received appeared to be this, it appeared to be N, and so it is some evidence that when these were delivered to the shipper, they were in a certain condition. And this is, of course, quite important, because if it gets somewhere else on the end of delivery and it's no longer in that condition, then the question is, who's responsible? You may have insurance if that has been taken out, but also questions around potential liability frameworks. And the vehicle for transferring the contract rights it embodies. So the key point here is this idea that it's a receipt, it's a reflection of the terms of the contract, it's evidence of the goods, but the key is this, that is a negotiable document of sale, and that it transfers ownership of the things when it is signed from one party to the next. And this enables it to be a mechanism for not only transferring ownership, but also for transferring risk under our various carriage frameworks. It also enables it to be used from the standpoint of a core document for delivery of documents for payments purposes under a letter of credit or a financing transaction. Basically to say that you have the bill of lading, therefore you have the ownership, the control, and therefore the payment can be released to the one who has sold the thing. And so, operationally, it's been difficult to duplicate in a technological framework. How have we seen it done? We have seen a number of approaches. We have had this thing that we looked at earlier when we were looking at technology and digitization, the letter, the multilateral framework for transferable electronic records from UNCITRAL, which is designed to deal with this. But it allows two parties to recognize, but it doesn't necessarily address the duplication problem. And how we've seen this addressed is really in the context of system design. One approach is one that we've talked about a number of times, which is to have a closed system. In other words, if you have a closed system, only certain parties are in the system, buyers, sellers, carriers, financiers, that you can have a single electronic entry that is clearly traceable and trackable in that system. The challenge is getting sufficient numbers of parties into the system. In other words, you've got a lot of potential buyers, sellers, shippers, and payers and financiers. And getting a sufficient critical mass into a single system has so far not really been practical. We've had a number of attempts, all of which have largely failed so far. The most famous of these is something called Bolero, B-O-L-E-R-O. Bolero is a closed system which was designed to enable electronic transfers of bills of lading for a variety of processes. But the end result is, despite a couple of decades of work, it never got sufficient take-up to be fully usable, and eventually it closed down a couple of years ago. And so we're now seeing a variety of other mechanisms, some blockchain-based, others not, to try to address this. Over the past year and a half, I've actually been involved in project from the Bank for International Settlements called Project Aperta, where essentially what we wanted to do was come up with a system that would basically allow communication of information between parties to a trade transaction, which would then trigger payments. And it sounds pretty straightforward when you think of it. But then you realize, on the basis of what we've looked at through this course, that in the context of a trade transaction, very frequently, your payment is on the basis of a structure like a letter of credit, which is on the basis of the presentation of documents. Now, if we're simply thinking about data transfer, it's not simply a point of transferring data from one party to another to release the payment obligation. One actually needs the document to be legally significant in order to release the payment. And what we found is, at the end of the day, we could say in the framework that a bill of lading had been presented, but we couldn't qualify that legally that had happened. So in other words, we still needed the paper-based process in order to then be reflected in our digital payment transaction. And so that's largely where we are in the context of bills of lading, in the context of trying to transform those into digital systems. Where it can work is if you have a closed system. The challenge is getting sufficient scale to get the network effects to work. And historically, trade has been problematic because you didn't have concentration in the shipping industry. In other words, you had lots and lots of shippers, lots and lots of ports, lots and lots of buyers and sellers, lots and lots of financiers, and it really made it impossible to put it all together. Air transport has been a little bit easier. Air transport, if we think about the difference, is time. If you think about sea takes time, and you've got lots of risks when the thing is on the ship. Air transport is typically pretty fast, point to point in less than 24 hours, and as a result, your time risks are less than in the context of sea shipment. It's also the case that sea shipment, because it's been going on for several thousand years, has a lot of path dependence built into it as a result of institutional and legal frameworks that were built over thousands of years. Air transport is pretty recent, and as a result, it made it easier to develop a framework that was simpler. Air transport is also much more concentrated historically than shipping. Now, one thing that we did see earlier in the course is shipping is becoming more concentrated. So in other words, as you get a smaller number of ever larger sea shipping companies, the possibility of putting together a system across those firms with a small number of banks becomes more possible. Air, and I'm going to provides an interesting example. And if we look at an air waybill or an air consignment note, is just a receipt. It's not a transfer of ownership. It's just a receipt to say that the airline has taken the thing that you've given to it, and ownership transfers when the thing is delivered, because you don't have a lot of time, and the risks are relatively less. An airway bill is a receipt issued by an international airline for goods and an evidence of the contract of carriage. Clearly, it is going to say what the contract of carriage is, where it's been picked up, who it's being delivered, and of course, what the liability framework is. It is not a document of title to the goods. The airway bill is generally non-negotiable. Contract of carriage behind every original airway bill are conditions of contract. Evidence of receipt of goods. When the shipper delivers goods to be forwarded, he will get a receipt. The receipt is proof that the shipment was handed over in good order and condition, and also the shipping instructions as contained in the shipper's letter of instructions are acceptable. After completion, an original copy of the airway bill is given to the shipper as evidence of the acceptance of goods and as proof of contract of carriage. Freight bill. The airway bill may be used as a bill or invoice together with supporting documents, since it may indicate charges to be paid by the consignee, charges due to the agent or the carrier. An original copier of the airway bill is used for the carrier's accountants. Certificate of insurance. The airway bill may also serve as an evidence if the carrier is in a position to insure the shipment and is requested to do so by the shipper. And a customs declaration. Although customs authorities require various documents like a commercial invoice, packing list, etc., the airway bill too is proof of the freight amount billed for the goods carried and may be needed to be presented for customs clearance. And this, I think, is an interesting example of something that has been successful from the standpoint of digitization of transport documents. And this one is doubly interesting because it also involves an international organization, but an international organization that is operating essentially a private system. So we saw earlier with the registry for the Cape Town Convention for Aircraft that the International Air Transport Association was in fact the organization tasked with establishing the registry. And so we see similarly, this has been a direct IATA initiative itself called eFreight or e-Airway Bill. eFreight is an industry-wide initiative involving carriers, freight forwarders, ground handlers, shippers, customs brokers, and customs authorities. eFreight aims to build an end-to-end paperless transportation process for air cargo through a regulatory framework, electronic messages, and high-quality data. The eFreight roadmap outlines a shared end-to-end industry approach to remove 3 types of documents. Customs documents, engaging regulators and governments worldwide to create an eFreight route network where customs procedures are fully electronic and regulations support paperless shipments. Transport documents, working collaboratively with the cargo supply chain to digitize the core industry transport documents, starting with the airway bill. And commercial and special cargo documents, developing a plan to digitize the commercial and special cargo documents typically accompanying air freight today in or out of the cargo pouch. And what you have here is essentially the various pieces of a framework which is in operation. The e-Airway Bill. The Airway Bill is a critical air cargo document that constitutes the contract of carriage between the shipper and the carrier airline. The electronic airway bill resolution removes the requirement, and so this is an industry resolution, removing the requirement for a paper airway bill. There is therefore no longer a need to print, handle, or archive the paper, simplifying the process. And so this then provides the various sorts of documents relating to the operation of the system. Cargo XML. This is messaging standard to cope with cargo transactions. EDGD, Electronic Dangerous Goods Shippers Declaration, obviously. Multilateral Airway Bill Agreement. The Multilateral Airway Bill Agreement provides a single standard agreement that airlines and freight forwarders can sign once with IATA and start doing an e-airway bill with other parties to the agreement. So effectively what this is a multilateral document that has terms and conditions that each time an airline signs, those terms then apply across all of the airline's signatories. And we now have essentially a good industry weight of airlines which are participating, which means that the e-airway bill has become very much standard practice in the industry. How this has taken place is kind of interesting because IATA is, of course, a formal treaty-based international organization. It actually has a lot of different treaties. What they have done is they have their membership is mainly airlines, but via states. And the airlines, in addition to agreeing or being governed by the framework of IATA, also can develop agreements amongst themselves to run systems. So in this case, you have this resolution that allows the use of e-airway bills by all of the signing airlines, and you have a web-based tool that makes it easier from the standpoint of interconnections. Why has this worked by comparison to the bill of lading? And the key reason is that there are relatively fewer airlines, that the time of air transport is relatively less, and most importantly, the airway bill is not a document of title. It's just a receipt. And so that makes it very easy to have a system which is basically about communication of receipts. And therefore that allows participants to easily track where shipments are and where they're going at any point in time. And it's been operationalized by a formal international organization, which is something that we really haven't seen much in international commercial law. Our organizations like UNIDROIT or UNCITRAL typically are just law-making organizations. They don't actually do stuff. So even if we see like the Cape Town Convention, the aircraft protocol is not operationalized by UNCITRAL itself. It's operationalized by a separate organization. Now, you do see, as we've seen, some examples where a private organization or an organization like the ICC will operationalize systems. This one probably works better because you have a formal treaty-based framework that provides for the relationships amongst the parties, a relatively smaller number of parties, a shorter time risk, and a document which from its very beginnings was not established as a title document, but only as a receipt. So, if one thinks about space, is space more like sea or more like air? Yeah, there's a good argument that in some cases it's more like sea, because certainly your time risk is higher. And as it happens, your delivery risks your risk of your space launch vehicle exploding on takeoff are thankfully much higher than the chances of your aircraft exploding on takeoff. They don't do that very often, thankfully. But space launch vehicles do. They explode all the time, much more often than ships sink. So there is, I think, an argument that space is maybe more like ships, but so far you do have a more concentrated industry, so there may be the possibility of developing a system. But one would expect that perhaps if over time space continues to develop as it is, that you might have a more standardized system from the standpoint of the transport document structures. Yeah. All right, so that effectively ties all of the last few pieces that I wanted to tie together too. Yeah?
How does it work? Air transportation, like in samples, using all these documents. How does it work? How's the process?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is something that most of us, unlike, most of us haven't necessarily actually shipped something by sea. If you've moved from continent to continent, you may have shipped stuff by sea, or you may have other things that have been shipped by sea. But most of us have actually shipped stuff by air, or certainly we have things delivered regularly by air. And so you can kind of see it in person. In other words, you take the thing to FedEx, you sign over your thing, they give you a receipt. That receipt is then given to the person at the other end of the transaction. The Amazon guy turns up, you have to sign for the thing, or there's some sort of clause that says that he or she can leave it on your doorstep or with your neighbor. But the key is that the piece of paper, the receipt's just a receipt. It's actually the details of the transport responsibility, but the piece of paper isn't actually doing much from a legal standpoint other than documenting the terms of the transport and delivery. Whereas with shipping, you put the thing on the ship, you get a bill of lading. That actually means that in many cases, it's actually transferred. The responsibility, the ownership of the thing has gone to somewhere else. And there will be, in the context of air, there will be a point where the risk transfers from one to the other. But it's not, the time is generally much shorter. So there hasn't been the necessity of using the sort of risk transfer mechanism of the bill of lading. In other words, we certainly have seen some examples throughout the course where ownership of stuff on a ship may actually be transferred while the ship's at sea. This has been really common recently with LNG, for instance, transferring the thing on the basis of the bill of lading while it's at sea. But generally speaking, you can't transfer the ownership of something that's going on an airplane. In other words, it's going from whoever's transferred it to whoever is getting it, and it's not in the air long enough in any event to transfer it. There could be some framework where, for instance, it's something really valuable like semiconductors, and you are transferring it, but it wouldn't necessarily be on the basis of the receipt. It would be on the basis of a contractual framework. Whereas C, because of the necessity in many cases of being able to make transfers while the thing was at sea, the framework of the bill of lading has developed out of commercial desirability to make those transfers possible, but also from the standpoint of risk management processes. But I think air and sea make a really interesting contrast, because air, they've built a framework that's essentially centralized for tracking. C has not been able to do so, despite lots and lots of international efforts and tons of articles by people. People continue to still use the paper-based thing because of that legal functionality. And it's something that we had this big conversation in the Aperta process that the tech designers, the developers, were like, okay, so all you need to do is transfer this bill of lading. All we need to do is say that the bill of lading has been transferred from A to B. It's just like sending an email. But then you actually have to explain that the bill of lading actually is more than just information. It has a legal function. And the transfer of it is more than just a data entry. And that has made the process very difficult to achieve so far. Others? Okay, so as I said, that essentially ties together the last kind of pieces across the course that I didn't think we had managed to tie together. And to kind of leave us as well with this space example, which is really rapidly developing, and one would think could follow the air context. But there are a lot of reasons why space may be more like sea than air, oddly enough. But we're still at pretty early stages. All right. Any final questions or comments on anything? Right. Super. Yeah. One.
Does this transport receipts ensure the possession of the goods as well? If we can say that ownership is transferred, so we can assume that the possession is also being transferred, or there is a separate document to ensure the possession of the goods like this?
Yeah, so from the standpoint of the air shipper, generally speaking, the air carrier never wants to take ownership. So they're always leaving, it's always with the shipper or the buyer. And the specifics of the contract can vary where that is, but basically the air carrier never wants to have this sort of responsibility. Whereas a sea carrier, they in some cases have been very, very happy to have that. Yeah. Right, good. Thanks very much, everyone. Enjoyed this one, and yeah, you'll get the exam soon enough. Thanks. Hey. Yeah, well, I think basically nobody is not looking for anybody, so I'm just taking the approach that apparently, I guess because we're after the class ends, yeah, even though I get a code on mine, and you guys get it on your timetable, for whatever reason, the system won't take it. Easy enough. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, certainly. Actually, probably the easiest thing is just sort of group together here, and then we'll just get one up. This room is remarkably good for that. So, yeah, just sort of move together this direction if you want in. If you don't want in, just move to the sides. Yeah. Yeah, that's actually quite good. Everybody ready? All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll send one around on the thing, the system. Yeah. Now this room works remarkably well for photos. It's-
How are you?
yeah.
I'll be leading the next semester.
Yeah.
I'm really excited for that.
Yeah.
But I forgot to bring something for you today. And I just want to make sure. I want to give you some Colombian coffee. Do you drink coffee?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so I'll see you next
Enjoy.
semester in class.
Thank you.
No.
Yeah.
I couldn't really understand this commercial aspect of like space, because as far as I understand, it's like in commercial transactions there are always two parties: a party who is the seller and the purchaser. So there's a time's distance between them, and of course it comes the insurance and the risk. But in space, what are exactly the parties and what goods are they expecting to insure?
And so this is an interesting because it can vary. In other words, it may well be that you are buying services from a satellite provider. So in other words, if someone has a satellite, they may be selling you the stuff, but that's not necessarily, we focus more on goods in this course. Another may well be that, for instance, you actually buy a satellite, but part of buying the satellite is also getting the service of getting the thing placed. Exactly. So the delivery is actually, it's not actually going to you, it's actually going to space, which is odd because we normally, you could think of like sea or air, it could be going to a third party, but typically it's not just going and being left somewhere. But with space, the transport is sending it and then leaving it there. So, you know, if you are, for instance, are Spacely build satellites, you want, for whatever reason, to buy a satellite, you could, one term would be that you could ask Spacey as the satellite seller to arrange the delivery of the satellite in space, or you could agree that you would arrange it yourself, in which case you would then engage directly with SpaceX or whoever from the standpoint of
To
actually.
deliver the satellite in space.
Exactly.
But another
And
question
so
that comes
it comes to the same sort of framework, but it gives you a different, you know, the way the transaction is structured, who's doing what, is different.
Okay. But another question that comes to my mind is actually how the insurance takes place in these transactions, because basically the environment is unpredictable, so
Yeah.
you cannot really know what's going to happen, and it's usually, you know, I mean, the chances of damages are 90% almost.
Yeah.
So how do they really ensure that?
Yeah, so actually this is something that Lloyd's, the specialist insurer, does a lot of space insurance in the same way that, you know, if you want it to insure a ship in a conflict zone, they may well do it, but the price is just going to be a lot. So that's one of the considerations are the risks and the costs of insurance, are they commercially justified? But now we're getting, you know, sufficient numbers of launches that the rate of failure is now predictable. In other words, it's higher than air crashes or ships sinking, but it's now kind of predictable. And so that then allows you as an insurance company that there are now thousands and thousands of launches and shipments taking place. And so if you can do them on a sort of portfolio basis, you know.
But like, do they have any limitations? I mean, because, you know,
I mean, there'll have to be certain, you know.
Because insurance companies usually tend to really run from the expense, actually, so they tend to actually find anything to not pay. So in such environment, how can they really do that? What are their limitations for insurance?
You know, and I think part of it is the initial transactions were often sufficiently high value that, you know, the satellite was expensive, but the value to whoever was doing it was also really high. And so they were willing to pay the insurance costs. But now that we have so many more satellites in space, the insurance costs may be less, though they can still be significant. So it varies. Some satellites are worth more than others, and therefore the insurance costs will vary depending upon the value of the satellite. Satellites now are, not too much more in some cases than a drone cost, and drone costs are now negligible.
But are they, for example, that this also for the insurance policies, does it also apply for this, for example, for like space exploration?
So
Is
that's
it something different?
Yeah, that we're not quite to that point.
Yeah.
Though, and that's kind
Because
of
the risks are even higher in
exactly.
that case. Yeah.
But if one were to actually, you can imagine that, say, mining on the moon is going to be more expensive and higher risk than, say,
Just setting up a satellite. Or
yeah,
something,
but if we think about some big projects like in the Canadian tundra where they built diamond mines, these have been hugely expensive and high risk as well. Or we also have undersea projects, and certainly if we're looking at a lot of sort of deep sea oil projects, the risks and costs are very high. So you'd kind of probably expect that probably the first one or two that it's going to be either self-insured or you're going to have like a corporate structure where you have a bunch of investors who are sharing the risk. This is where we got the corporation structure in the first place, is basically taking a ship and having 100 shareholders. So even if you couldn't get insurance, if the thing sank, you didn't all lose all of your money. And so my guess is your first few commercial projects would probably be like that, where they would be corporate structures where investors would take the risk. But then if you get one or two that work, then the insurance companies will come in.
Yeah, I see. One last question concerning the exam.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, because you said earlier that, that we're expected to actually use real-life examples. So in that scenario, is it okay to actually, like refer to one of the websites? I mean,
Yeah,
like the
absolutely.
news website, because in essay writings usually say do not really rely on them that much, and it's really not proper to actually use them as a resource. So I was just wondering if it's
Yeah,
fine.
absolutely. And certainly you guys have access to the FT, and that's
Yeah,
easy.
because also like some of the links that you have already like shared with us, I mean, we can also use them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
You're welcome.
It's nice. Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
So I do have a
Yeah.
question. So, Professor, the first one is related to leasing and the difference between leasing, basically renting.
So it's actually quite similar. The difference really is that in many legal systems, a lease gives you, if you will, a slightly higher quality property interest or quality interest than you might get in a pure rent contract, but often they're very interchangeable.
So, what better interest?
No, better protection for the person leasing the thing. They have a more solid interest. A lease term is fixed and it's kind of your thing for that period. And rent is often seen as a lesser right from the standpoint of the renter.
Renting is just only having the possession of the property.
Yeah, though in many cases you think about, we use often the terms interchangeably. In other words, if you're renting a place in London, it's a lease, generally. But the assumption is that, rent is going to be a lesser interest than a lease, that a lease is somehow a stronger right to whatever it is for the possessor than renting.
And and how it is shown.
Yeah, so this would be the contractual right would often, just by defining it as a lease, that will often come with a different set of legal rights than just say you've rented something.
Because as far as I'm concerned, I'm not but in the area, people use leasing more with cars and renting
Yeah,
with
exactly.
credits.
And so, like, if you lease a car, you basically have full control of it for the term of the lease. Whereas if you just rented it, the expectation is you are just using it for a short period of time. So it's, as I said, it's actually the rights with a lease are typically stronger than rent. We do often use them interchangeably. In other words, if you rent a house, often you're actually leasing it.
Yes, yes, but because it's been used like different terms, I was like, okay, there
Yeah,
should be a difference.
but legally, a lease is generally a stronger set of rights than a rental.
Excellent. So my other question is regarding, because I know in Belgium where we use the CISG, we also use the BSB
Yeah, exactly.
And I think I'm missing some. So we use them depending on which country signed
Yeah,
that
exactly.
convention.
Exactly. And with the Hague Visby, it can be more complicated because you have more versions, and someone may have signed one and not another. Yeah. And that's something that, as you say, in a sort of maritime law course, you would delve into these. Whereas we really, because there's an entire course, skipped over the Hague Visby rules.
Sorry,
Yeah.
regarding to financing, because it was basically mentioned that the main way of financing is by letter of credit.
A letter of credit it's a payment mechanism, but there is a financing mechanism embedded in it as well because you've added time. In other words, with a letter of credit, payment doesn't take place at the very beginning. It takes place at a certain point later. And so that means that you have effectively added in an element of financing, and you're being charged for that by the letter of credit provider, the bank. There's a fee for a letter of credit, and that's essentially the charge for the time.
So there's a difference between financing and paying.
So paying, basically, the difference between payment and financing largely is a matter of time.
So when financing...
In other words, if I say I'm going to pay you in 30 days...
That's financing.
Exactly. Because I've really asked you to loan me money for 30 days.
Yes.
And
so
so
that was the difference between
and this
loan
is
and
exactly,
financing.
this is always the case. A loan is a type of financing. But the key is between payment and finance is time. No time, it's payment. But if you add in time, then that's finance.
Okay. Just one more thing.
Yeah?
About the supply chain. Because this topic really I'm not experienced or clear about it. So basically, it is the process in which the goods are delivered to the buyer, isn't it?
Well, the supply chain is more about how the goods are, it's all the various pieces. So in other words, if...
It includes the financing.
Yeah, but it's also, in other words, getting all the pieces together. Like, so think about an iPhone. In other words, the supply chain for the iPhone is actually all of the pieces coming together until the thing is there, and then the thing gets delivered.
So it's not Amazon, obviously.
There's lots of transportation, but it's all kinds of different pieces. And that the key to the supply chain is really the specialization, that you're thinking not just of the final iPhone going from Apple to a reseller, but actually all of the components, all of the resources that go into that. And that's really your sort of supply chain.
I think I'm covering everything because this is, I really like commercial. And again, with aviation, I don't know anything
Mhm.
really except of what you mentioned.
Yeah.
But I believe that the Cape Town Convention is it's more about financing.
It is, exactly.
Rather than, for example, the CASG, which
Exactly,
governs.
which is, exactly. So Cape Town Convention is really for aircraft financing. But what is interesting is you have the same sort of approach where you have IATA given responsibility for putting together the registry. So that's, but yeah, so no, it is very much a sort of financing convention.
There is another convention which is like very important and signed by a lot of countries regarding air transportation. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got your whole sort of, you've got a series of air treaties that are about airspace rights and all sorts of things that are not necessarily part of the commercial framework, but they're really important from the standpoint of, rights of airlines, rights of countries, etc.
And regarding insurance, I suppose they have their own insurance.
Yes.
And I also suppose that the airlines don't want to get any type of obligation.
Yeah,
regarding
no.
the insurance.
And because of this fact that, differences in bargaining power between, say, your air passenger and an airline, the air treaties govern liability frameworks. So they actually provide maximum amounts, but responsibility on airlines up to certain amounts, etc. So they actually, one thing they do is they provide a very clear liability framework for air transport.
And is it different with transporting people?
Yeah.
With goods?
Yes, it is, though the treaties cover both.
Oh.
Yeah.
And just one more question. Okay. So as the book says, conventions are basically treaties, international treaties.
Yep, exactly.
That countries they may or may not accept completely.
Exactly.
So if they don't like a part of it,
Exactly. They can have a
won't
reservation.
sign it.
Exactly.
But not all of them let them have reservations.
Yes.
And the treaty should say that.
Yes.
Is there anything else about that that I should know?
No, but I mean, it's, you can sort of see it. Some treaties don't really allow, and some treaties basically you have very few reservations. Some treaties allow reservations, and some treaties you have more reservations than others. So it's something that is kind of specific to each case.
Okay. And now the last one. No,
Yeah.
because when we were talking about the air transportation, and now that we are talking also about e-way bills.
Yeah, airway bills. Yeah.
Airway bills. And the distinction between the C one and the air one. First, basically, is the type
So
of document.
an airway bill and a seaway bill are similar, but a bill of lading
Is different.
Is different. Yeah.
Oh, the C-well different is also a C.
Yeah, it is.
And, okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And the last thing was, yes. So, these international treaties that apparently like airlines sign, but it contains terms and conditions. Those terms and conditions are about what specifically
So basically it's the treaties are between the states, but then the states govern their airlines. So in other words, if it's signed by the UK, airlines that are authorized by the UK are governed by the UK. So there are a lot of air treaties, and they cover a whole bunch of different things.
But
Yeah.
basically, the states govern all the airlines, but the airlines are particular
So, yeah, so yes, you have this framework where the treaty is amongst the states, but then the airlines are from states. And so, so you know, the British Airlines, yeah.
For example, I mean, it should be allowed. Like,
And so they're governed by the treaty that's signed by the government.
Not like a private company.
Exactly. But then you do also have, because there are a limited number of airlines, you also have systems that are set up between the airlines under the framework of the international organization. In other words, the international organization is there, they're an organization. And
Which one is it? Is it
IATA.
IATA. the one
Yeah,
you mentioned. Okay.
exactly, exactly. And that IATA will, like the airway bill, it will establish frameworks which then airlines can join. So it's a public international organization, but it will do things that will involve private companies
So
as
those
well.
are the ones that will take action.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
for
No,
your
no,
time.
it's really good. Thanks. Yeah. Hey. Yeah.
So, Professor, I don't have many questions.
Yeah.
Really, I want to ask is that I'm not been keeping well recently, so I've not been able to keep up with my studies. And if I want to get in contact with you to ask you questions once I'm
Yeah,
how
no
could
problem.
I contact you?
Email is.
Email?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, that's all. And also, thank you for your advice. I feel like I've enjoyed that my life throughout your section.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's yeah, let me think a little bit about it. All I do is I sort of see myself as separate. Yeah, no, this is, I've got a lot of these, and I need to come up with some better ideas on suggestions. So, yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, thanks, guys. Have a good night.